Hey everyone, we're back this week with our health series called Hormone Happy Hour that I do with Kaya Perowit, my co-host and co-founder in our business, Bia Wellness. We interview the top experts in women's health, hormones, mindset, sexual health, and so much more. Health is a huge part of running a successful business and having a fulfilling life. So it's my honor to share these interviews that show us how to eat, think, move, and live in a way that is designed to help us feel great so we can build our own empire. Now, let's jump into this week's episode.
It's still so mind-blowing to me that women struggle with more autoimmune diseases than men do. I think actually 80% of cases of autoimmune disease come from women. Women also struggle with more digestive diseases than men do. Obviously, women go through tons of hormonal shifts throughout their life. Being a woman is just the gift that keeps on giving, but truly, it actually is. And we're so lucky to be talking to Dr. Sara Szal Gottfried today, who is just a pioneer in the space of women's hormonal health and now in autoimmune disease as well. And we have such an amazing conversation with her today about the role of stress and trauma in disease, specifically for women, and how things like burnout and trying to keep up with the Joneses and trying to do it all is actually contributing to a chronic disease epidemic in women. It's such a mind-blowing and beautiful conversation, and we're so excited for you guys to listen to it.
Our guest this week is our dear friend, Dr. Sara Szal Gottfried. She's a Harvard-trained, board-certified gynecologist and clinical assistant professor of integrative medicine and nutritional sciences at Thomas Jefferson University. She specializes in hormone health, vitality, and longevity using precision and personalized approaches. She's a 4 times New York Times bestselling author, and her new book, The Autoimmune Cure, is out this week. It's all about the role of stress and trauma in autoimmune diseases, and we talk all about this and so much more in our episode today. So let's get into it.
I want to start with autoimmune. I heard Gabor Mate once say that 80% of the people who suffer from autoimmune diseases are women. And I want to know, why do you think that is?
I've been taking care of women for 30 years. And so I can tell you from my clinical experience, from tracking the science for 3 decades, and from living in a female body, that women are more vulnerable. Really, it's a health hazard to be female in our culture. And a lot of that is our culture and not what makes us women. So why is that? Number one, women are exposed to more trauma. So we know that in terms of the original studies that were done on adverse childhood experiences. So women experience on average about 10% more than those who are assigned male at birth. And then we go through these sweeping hormone changes. So puberty is what kicks it off. Then we've got pregnancy, postpartum, perimenopause, menopause. And a lot of people think of those as hormonal changes, and they are, but they're also massive immunometabolic changes. So your metabolism changes, your immune system, your innate immune system, your adaptive immune system, they dramatically change. So there's some sex differences. Then there's gender differences, kind of the socially constructed differences that we see between those who are assigned female versus male at birth. And so I would put the trauma exposure into a gender difference. And then there's kind of this culture that we live in, which is not set up for women to be in a state of optimal health. So those are some of the basic reasons. And even when you look at trauma, when you look at people, men and women who are exposed to the same trauma, like wartime trauma, women have higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder. There are some major sex and gender differences. And once again, women are at a disadvantage. So that's what we've got to change.
And I'm curious, Sara, how do you define trauma? I know it's like a wide spectrum, but so many of us, like you said, are kind of living in this. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you define that.
The definition is an overwhelming experience. So people tend to break trauma down into a couple of different categories, kind of the big T trauma, the things that everyone agrees are, something life-threatening, something catastrophic, having a loved one die, surviving the Holocaust, surviving another genocide, going through the 9/11 terrorist attack. So there are big T traumas, and then there are these small T traumas. And they're more of the things that may not quite measure as high as some of those big T traumas. But what's interesting about trauma is that it continues to live on in your system, in your body. And in some ways, it's not so much what happened to you, it's more how does that continue to live on in your body? And we tend to focus a lot with Gabor Mate, with some other writers, Paul Conti, about the mental health effects of trauma, kind of the downstream consequences of toxic stress. So we look at post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, disordered eating, and we don't spend as much time focused on the physical effects, the dysregulation that can continue in the body as a result of trauma. And that's where I'm focused. I'm really interested in that mental and physical interface. And, over my career, I've looked at the things like blood sugar and how that gets dysregulated by trauma, by toxic stress. I've looked at hormones. And so when you look at the stress response system and how trauma can make it dysregulated, you can define it as the PINE network. So that's kind of an easy way to remember the systems of the body that get the most dysregulated by trauma. And so PINE stands for your psychology, your immune system, your neurological system, and then your endocrinological system or your hormones.
Can you share about your experience with your autoimmune condition and your healing journey, which I think is a big part of your upcoming book?
It is, yeah. So I've written quite a bit about hormones, and I've written about blood sugar issues, and some of the ways that I've found have been the most helpful for my patients, my clients, and then for myself. And what I realized when I was just tracking through the pandemic, what was happening with the patients that I was taking care of, is that so many people with immune dysfunction, whether that's long COVID or getting a classic autoimmune diagnosis like Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which I diagnose almost every day, multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes. What we know is that the immune system can become dysregulated pretty easily. And for the reasons that we just talked about, the female immune system is much more vulnerable to this level of dysregulation. So what happened for me was that I started to have some vague symptoms, which are really classic when you're talking about autoimmunity. And when I think about autoimmunity, it's where your immune system becomes confused. And this kind of front line of warriors that you have in your immune system start to battle your own tissues. And it becomes like a civil war. And when you think about it, Kaya, between the normal immune system to a state of autoimmune disease, classic autoimmune diseases, of which there are 100 now, there's this vast spectrum in between of autoimmunity. And that's the 7 to 14 years of your immune system just not quite being the protector that it's meant to be, not quite as benevolent as it's meant to be. So what I found for myself as I started to run my own tests and run my own labs to see if I had immune system dysregulation, I had a high level of inflammation, and I had antibodies, which are, part of the constellation of what we're looking for, signs and symptoms that go with autoimmune disease. I had anti-nuclear antibodies. So I was developing antibodies against the nucleus of the cells of my body, and that's not normal. And we're not talking about like a little smidge of anti-nuclear antibodies. I had really high levels. And so this got me to start to look at, in functional medicine, we think a lot about a disease like Hashimoto's, a disease like rheumatoid arthritis. And we think, okay, what can we do in the years leading up to a diagnosis to try to turn that ship around? And so that's what I became focused on with my own body. And of course, it's not about me. It's about how can we then start to think about the 4 to 6 years that people struggle with mysterious symptoms that no one is putting together into a diagnosis of autoimmunity or autoimmune disease. And how can we help those people? Because it's so frustrating to not get answers when you've got these mysterious symptoms. And we know on average for people who end up with a diagnosis of autoimmune disease, they see about 4 to 7 doctors over years and years. And so this is one of those places where people are failed by the medical system. And so when these things occur in my system, when I see the anti-nuclear antibodies, I consider that a divine call to pay attention and to say, okay, what's going on here? Why the epidemic rise in autoimmune disease? Is it related to the pandemic? Yes, it seems to be. Are anti-nuclear antibodies on the rise? Yes, they've increased significantly over the past 20 to 30 years, just since I've been a doctor. So that's a bit of my personal experience. And then I found through using some of the protocols that I've got in the book, The Autoimmune Cure, I've been able to reverse those anti-nuclear antibodies. So I no longer have positive anti-nuclear antibodies. And I think a lot of it is resolving the trauma that was in my system, the signature of trauma.
I feel like there's so many women listening in who just resonate so much with your own story and kind of what you've seen with patients. And, you know, I'm curious from your perspective, I know you go into detail in this further in your book, but what were some things that kind of have resolved your own trauma?
Well, you know, I've been writing about hormones, cortisol, progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, DHEA, oxytocin, insulin. I've been writing about hormones for 15 years, and those are my bread and butter. In some ways, I've optimized my hormone balance, so my cortisol is better than it's ever been. My estrogen and progesterone, fantastic. I'm so happy with them. And yet, there was a way that I still feel like I had trauma in my body that was affecting my relationships. It was, you know, my cortisol is better, my blood sugar is better, but I still can tell you that when I experience significant stress, like I went through a divorce last year, when I experience significant stress, it still causes dysregulation. And this, I want to really pay attention here for our listeners, because I feel like we're more dysregulated than ever before in our history. And if you look at things like your resting heart rate, the deep sleep that you're getting each night, the total sleep, the sleep quality, when you look at heart rate variability, which is a measure of your autonomic nervous system, that balance between fight, flight, freeze, fawn, which is what women tend to do, the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic nervous system, which is stay and play. When we look at the balance between the two with heart rate variability, we're just seeing so much dysregulation. So I feel like in some ways, I feel like trauma is inevitable. Toxic stress is inevitable. Yes, you can buffer yourself, you can change the way that you perceive it, but the first step is to really look at, how is toxic stress living in your body? Is there a way that you could dance with it that might serve you better, might not have the cost of infertility, hormone imbalances, maybe developing autoimmunity? So in my own system, when I saw these anti-nuclear antibodies and I put it together with the toxic stress that I was managing, I realized I've got to do something different here. And so I discovered that I had not post-traumatic stress disorder, but partial PTSD. And I see this in a lot of my patients, kind of a functional PTSD where it's not, like the war veteran who's got flashbacks and nightmares and, wakes up hyperventilating, but more kind of this low-level hypervigilance that doesn't serve us well. And in my case, I was doing a lot of dissociation, kind of going upstairs, going cognitive when I was facing a problem and ignoring my body from the neck down. And I find that so many people do that. So it came up in particular with a fight with a family member. So I've got this beloved family member, and we had a falling out that had never happened to me before, even though I've got pretty high adverse childhood experiences. My score is 6, basically 0 is normal or healthy. Anything above that is high. And when I had this experience with this family member, it was around the same time that we were seeing all these studies come out about MDMA-assisted therapy. So this was work that was driven by Rick Doblin, the head of MAPS. He has published a couple of randomized trials now showing that for people with post-traumatic stress disorder, MDMA-assisted therapy is probably about twice as effective as the standard of care. The standard of care is talk therapy, maybe trauma-informed therapy, together with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, but those only have an efficacy of around 30%. Whereas when you look at MDMA-assisted therapy, we know that it gets people to a place after 2 to 3 sessions of no longer meeting criteria for PTSD in somewhere around 2/3 to 71% of the people who were enrolled. So to me, that just kind of blew my mind. This happened along with this falling out with a family member. And so I said to myself, listen, I'm in my 50s. Like, the time is now. Like, what am I waiting for? I want to do everything I can to resolve the signature of trauma in my body, the way that it impacts my relationships, the way that it impacts my blood sugar and my HRV, and the way that I sleep. So that started me on this journey of looking at, okay, how can I modulate my immune system? And, that's the things we think about: vitamin D, curcumin, resveratrol, methylators, polyphenols, but it's also psychedelics. So psychedelics have a really important immunomodulating effect. They have a really important effect on your hormones going forward, a really important effect on your neurological system. So that's what got me to really address my trauma. And I still feel like psychedelics are one of the most important immunomodulators that we have.
Hey everyone, it's Yasmin here. In 2020, I was struggling with some debilitating health stuff. I just got off birth control and suddenly I had acne, mood swings, breast tenderness, and really painful periods. I tried so many things, but the one thing that worked was something called seed cycling. I know you're probably thinking, seed cycling? What the heck is that? It's a natural way to support your hormones using 4 specific seeds throughout your cycle. The challenge is that seed cycling can be a little complicated to do and kind of time consuming. So I decided to make an organic seed cycling product that is so easy to use. We make it effortless for anyone to get started today. It's called BIA, and it's a super easy way to add something powerful to your diet to support your hormones, regulate your cycle, and bring back balance. To learn more about BIA and join our community with thousands of incredible women all over the world, go to biawellness.com, and that's spelled BEEYA wellness.com. And check out the show notes for our promo code to get $10 off your first purchase. Thanks so much for listening, and now let's get back to today's episode.
You mentioned the pandemic earlier, and I'm curious because in so many ways, our modern world feels easier than ever. We have access to whatever, a lot of us, not everyone, but we have access to whatever food we want. We can turn on anything on the TV. We can contact our friends at any given moment. We can get in our cars. We can travel easily. But what is it about this particular time that you think is causing so much dysregulation?
I think it's multifactorial. So number one, the pandemic has led to isolation and being cut off from community in a way that we've never seen in our lifetimes. So people had that during the influenza epidemic, but very few people are still alive from that period. I think it also led to pretty dramatic mental health changes, some of which are driven by the social aspects of sheltering in place. So we know that there's an exponential rise in anxiety, depression, even post-traumatic stress disorder. And then separately, there's data suggesting that COVID infection and long COVID has these untoward effects on a lot of different systems of the body. And I'm not talking about conspiracy. I'm not talking about, I would say, if anything, I'm kind of in the middle ground in terms of thinking about spike protein and what that does. But we are seeing, there's some data looking at the VAERS kind of tracking of adverse results with vaccination. We're seeing pretty significant increases in terms of autoimmune disease in this period of time post-pandemic. And we're still at the earliest stages of tracking some of these things. And even the way we track autoimmune disease in the US leaves a lot to be desired. So I think the pandemic has had direct effects, and then there's also these indirect effects as a result of how it changed the way that we get together, the way that we commune, the way that we turn to our culture for support and stress management. And, the thing that women do so well, which is to tend and befriend, it was really hard to do that, right? Like we were doing it over Zoom, which leaves a lot to be desired.
Yeah. And even anecdotally, I probably know a handful of women who developed autoimmune disease right after having COVID, or maybe they believe it was the vaccine. I'm not sure, but pretty much within 1 to 2 years of 2020, 2021, MS, other different types of autoimmune disease.